To understand this mystery, we need to go back to the summer of 1915. At the time, the First World War had already reached a deadly stalemate. Across Europe, millions of soldiers were locked in brutal trench warfare. Neither side seemed capable of delivering a decisive victory. Military leaders were searching desperately for a breakthrough, and that search led them to a narrow stretch of water known as the Dardanelles. At first glance, it looked insignificant. A thin passage connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea, but its strategic importance was enormous. Whoever controlled the Dardanelles controlled one of the most important supply routes in the region. British planners believed that capturing it could change the course of the war. It could open a direct route to Russia. It could weaken the Ottoman Empire, and it might even force Germany's allies out of the conflict altogether. The plan seemed bold. Some believed it could end the war sooner. Others warned it was far too risky. But in the spring of 1915, the operation moved forward. Thousands of British, Australian, New Zealand, French, and colonial troops were sent to the Gallipoli Peninsula. Their mission appeared straightforward: land on the beaches, push inland, capture key positions, and secure control of the region. But almost nothing went according to plan. The beaches were heavily defended. The terrain was far more difficult than expected. Steep ridges overlooked the landing zones. Deep ravines cut across the landscape, and accurate maps were often unavailable. Every advance became a struggle. Every hill had to be fought for. Every yard of ground came at a terrible cost. As the months passed, Gallipoli became something far different from what commanders had envisioned. The summer heat was relentless. Water was scarce. Disease spread through the camps. Flies covered food, equipment, and even the wounded. Many soldiers later described the peninsula as a living nightmare, and despite the sacrifices, very little progress was being made. The campaign had become a war of exhaustion, a place where confusion was common, where units frequently lost contact with one another, and where a single mistake could erase hundreds of lives. It was in this environment that the mystery of the missing soldiers would unfold. But before they vanished, there was something unusual about the men themselves, because many of them were not career soldiers. They came from a place few would expect, and their connection to the British king would make their disappearance impossible to ignore. Belonged to the 105th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment. Among them was a unit that would later become famous around the world, the Sandringham Company. At first, there seemed to be nothing extraordinary about these men. They wore the same uniforms, carried the same rifles, and followed the same orders as thousands of other soldiers fighting across Europe. But there was one detail that made them different. Many of them had worked on the royal estates of King George V. They were gardeners, gamekeepers, farm workers, drivers, laborers, men who had spent years working on the king's properties in Norfolk. Many knew each other long before the war began. Some were neighbors, others were lifelong friends. A few were even related. When Britain entered the war, they volunteered together, trained together, and eventually sailed to Gallipoli together. For the communities they left behind, this battalion represented far more than a military unit. These were familiar faces, men whose families had lived in the same villages for generations. Their departure was watched by entire communities. Parents, wives, brothers, children, like millions of others across Europe, they believed the war would eventually end and their loved ones would return home. Few imagined that some of those men would never be seen again. By the summer of 1915, the battalion had already experienced months of hardship. Gallipoli was proving far more dangerous than anyone had expected. The offensive had stalled. Casualties continued to rise, and frustration was growing among Allied commanders. Military leaders desperately needed a breakthrough, a successful attack, a captured position, any sign that progress was still possible. That pressure would lead to a series of new operations across the peninsula. Among them was an offensive near a region known as Anafarta. The objective was simple: push forward, seize key ground, and force the Ottoman defenders to retreat. For the men of the Norfolk Regiment, it was another mission in a campaign already filled with danger. Nothing suggested that history was about to remember this attack differently from countless others. No one believed they were marching toward a mystery. No one believed they were marching toward a mystery. No one believed their names would still be discussed more than a century later. To the soldiers themselves, it was simply another day of war, another order, another advance, another attempt to survive. But as preparations continued, events were already beginning to unfold that would change everything. Because on August 12, 1915, the battalion received orders that would send them into one of the most controversial episodes of the First World War. And once the advance began, something went terribly wrong. The afternoon of August 12, 1915, the attack finally began. The men of the Norfolk Regiment moved forward under a blazing summer sun. Ahead of them lay a landscape that was already familiar to every soldier in Gallipoli. Dry grass, thick scrub, dust, smoke, and terrain that seemed designed to confuse anyone trying to cross it. The objective was part of a larger Allied offensive near Anafarta. Several units were expected to advance together, capture key positions, and continue pushing inland. At least, that was the plan. But as often happened at Gallipoli, reality quickly intervened. The battlefield was chaotic. Communication between units was unreliable. Visibility changed constantly as smoke drifted across the ground. Officers struggled to maintain contact with neighboring formations. And as the attack developed, some units began moving at different speeds. According to British reports, elements of the Norfolk Regiment continued advancing while other formations lagged behind. At first, this may not have seemed unusual. Battlefields rarely unfolded exactly as commanders expected. But with every yard gained, the Norfolk men moved farther from supporting forces, farther from reinforcement, farther from anyone who could clearly see what was happening. The terrain only made matters worse. Small ridges blocked lines of sight. Vegetation concealed movement, and the folds of the landscape could hide entire groups of men within minutes. Observers positioned behind the advancing troops watched as the battalion pushed forward, then disappeared into the broken terrain. Some reports describe the men moving into an area covered by scrub and low vegetation. Others mention that portions of the battalion advanced beyond the positions of neighboring units. What happened next remains one of the most debated moments of the entire campaign, because from the perspective of many British observers, the men simply vanished from view. Not in a dramatic instant, not all at once, but gradually, as the battlefield swallowed them. Minutes passed, then more, yet no clear reports came back. No messengers arrived with updates. No officers returned with explanations. The attack had carried the battalion beyond the view of many of their own comrades. And somewhere ahead, hidden by terrain, vegetation, and smoke, events were unfolding that few people fully understood. For those waiting behind the lines, uncertainty quickly replaced confidence. Had the attack succeeded? Had the men reached their objective? Had they become trapped? No one seemed to know. And as the hours passed, the absence of answers became increasingly alarming. What made the situation even more troubling was that reports coming from the front were often contradictory. Some suggested the battalion had continued advancing. Others indicated they had encountered heavy resistance. Still others claimed they had become separated during the attack. But no single account could explain exactly what had happened. And that uncertainty would prove crucial. Because in the years that followed, the gaps left by those missing details would allow an extraordinary story to emerge. A story involving a strange cloud, a mysterious disappearance, and a version of events that would capture imaginations around the world. But before that legend appeared, military commanders faced a far more immediate problem. Hundreds of men had gone forward, and many of them were no longer coming back. Guerreros prompts para 023. The fate of the missing soldiers remained uncertain. The war continued. Battles were fought. Empires collapsed, and eventually Gallipoli became history. But for many families, the questions never disappeared. What had happened to the men who never returned? Were they killed in battle, captured by Ottoman forces, or had something else occurred on that distant battlefield? For decades, no one could provide a definitive answer. Then, many years after the war, a remarkable story began to circulate. According to a statement that gained attention in the 1960s, several veterans from New Zealand claimed they had witnessed something unusual on the day of the attack. They describe a strange cloud resting close to the ground. Unlike ordinary clouds, this one reportedly remained motionless despite the wind. According to the account, British soldiers advanced toward it. They entered the cloud and never emerged. The story became even stranger. The witnesses claimed that after the last soldiers disappeared inside, the cloud slowly rose and drifted away, leaving no trace of the men behind. It was the kind of story that seemed impossible to ignore. And once it appeared in print, it spread rapidly. Writers repeated it. Magazines published it. Books referenced it. Over time, the account became one of the most famous legends associated with the Gallipoli campaign. For many people, it appeared to offer an explanation for the disappearance. If no one had seen the soldiers return, and no one knew exactly where they had gone, then perhaps something extraordinary had happened. As the years passed, the theories became increasingly dramatic. Some suggested a supernatural event. Others proposed a phenomenon that science could not explain. By the second half of the 20th century, the story had even attracted the attention of UFO enthusiasts. According to some versions, the soldiers had not been killed at all. They had been taken, transported somewhere else, removed from the battlefield entirely. The more the story was repeated, the more mysterious it became. But there was a problem, a very serious problem. The story appeared decades after the battle itself, not days later, not months later, decades later. And when historians began examining wartime records, they noticed something unusual. The reports written during the campaign described confusion, heavy fighting, lost units, and missing soldiers. But they did not describe a mysterious cloud swallowing an entire battalion. The absence of that detail immediately raised questions. Were the witnesses remembering events accurately after so many years? Had memories become mixed with stories told long after the war? Or was there something else that historians were missing? The deeper researchers looked into the case, the more complicated it became. Because the legend of the cloud was only one part of the mystery, there was another problem. Even the military commanders responsible for the operation seemed unable to explain exactly what had happened. Reports differed, accounts conflicted, and in some cases, officers were left trying to reconstruct events they had never personally witnessed. The result was a puzzle with missing pieces, and that puzzle would keep historians busy for generations. Because if the cloud story could not be confirmed, then what did the official records actually say? And why were so many military reports unable to provide a clear answer? The search for those answers would eventually lead investigators deep into wartime archives, where they would discover that the confusion surrounding the disappearance was far greater than anyone had imagined. The story of the mysterious cloud attracted most of the attention. It was dramatic, it was unusual, and it offered a simple explanation for an event that seemed impossible to understand. But historians investigating the case eventually realized that the most interesting evidence was not found in the legend. It was found in the official records, the reports written by officers during and immediately after the battle. Those documents revealed something unexpected. The commanders themselves were struggling to understand what had happened. In the days following the attack, information was scarce. The battlefield remained under Ottoman control. Large sections of the area were inaccessible, and many of the soldiers who might have explained what happened were either missing, wounded, or dead. As reports moved up the chain of command, uncertainty followed them. Officers attempted to reconstruct the attack using fragmented information, witness statements, messages from the front, observations made from a distance. but no one possessed a complete picture. One report suggested the battalion had pushed forward aggressively and become isolated. Another implied that the men had advanced beyond the support of neighboring units. Some accounts mentioned heavy resistance. Others simply acknowledged that contact had been lost. The result was confusion. Even senior commanders were forced to rely on assumptions. In some cases, they knew where the attack had begun, but not where it had ended. One of the most frequently quoted descriptions came from General Sir Ian Hamilton's official dispatches. He described how part of the Norfolk Battalion continued advancing into wooded terrain and was effectively lost from view. His report included a phrase that would become famous: "The men had advanced into the forest and were seen no more." It was a powerful statement, and for many readers it sounded almost supernatural. But that was not how military officers intended it. They were describing a battlefield, a place filled with smoke, confusion, uneven terrain, and broken communication. The problem was that nobody could clearly observe what happened after the battalion disappeared from sight. And because no clear explanation emerged, rumors quickly filled the gaps. The uncertainty became even more painful for families back home. Months passed, then years. Many relatives still had no definitive answer. Were their loved ones prisoners of war? Had they died during the attack? Or were they still waiting to be found somewhere beyond the battlefield? The British government tried to gather information. Investigators questioned former prisoners. Military records were reviewed, but no breakthrough came. The mystery remained, and in many ways, it seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. Then the war ended. The guns fell silent. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and for the first time, investigators gained access to areas that had been unreachable during the conflict. What they found there would change the story completely, because hidden among the hills and farms of Gallipoli was evidence that had remained untouched for years. Evidence that would finally begin to reveal what happened to the missing men. But it would also raise new questions. Questions that historians are still discussing today. War eventually came to an end. The guns fell silent, the trenches were abandoned, and the Gallipoli campaign became part of history. But for many families, the story was far from over. Hundreds of names still appeared on lists of missing soldiers. Among them were many of the men from the Norfolk Regiment. For years, relatives had hoped for answers. Some believed their loved ones might have been taken prisoner. Others feared they had died somewhere beyond the battlefield, their bodies never recovered. Now, for the first time since the fighting had ended, investigators had an opportunity to search the ground where the men had disappeared. Teams returned to Gallipoli. Their mission was straightforward: locate the missing, identify burial sites, and provide answers wherever possible. It was difficult work. The landscape had changed. Years had passed. Many landmarks described in wartime reports were no longer easy to identify, yet investigators continued searching. Then came a discovery that would become one of the most important developments in the entire case. Near a farm not far from the area where the battalion had advanced, search teams found human remains. Not a few isolated bodies, dozens of them, scattered across a relatively small area. The discovery immediately attracted attention. Investigators began examining uniforms, insignia, and personal effects. Slowly, a picture started to emerge. Many of the dead belonged to the Norfolk Regiment. Some could be identified directly. Others could only be linked to the battalion through equipment and location. According to the reports, approximately 180 bodies were found in the area. Of those, around 120 were identified as members of the Norfolk Regiment. For the first time, there was physical evidence showing that at least part of the missing battalion had not vanished without a trace. They had died on the battlefield. The discovery brought a measure of closure to some families, but it did not solve the mystery completely. In fact, it raised new questions. The location of the remains suggested that the battalion had advanced farther than many earlier reports had indicated, far enough to become separated from supporting forces, far enough to enter extremely dangerous territory. There were also reports describing bodies found beyond positions where British commanders had expected the battalion to be. This suggested that at least some of the men had continued pushing forward long after observers lost sight of them. The discovery seemed to support one conclusion. The soldiers had not disappeared into thin air. They had reached the battlefield beyond British observation. And whatever happened there had unfolded largely unseen. Yet important questions remained unanswered. How had so many men become isolated? Why had no clear reports emerged during the battle? And what exactly had happened during those final moments? The answers would not come from British records alone. For decades, historians were forced to rely primarily on one side of the story. Then researchers began examining something that had rarely been used in earlier investigations: Ottoman military archives. Documents written by the very soldiers who had been fighting on the opposite side. And what those records revealed would transform the understanding of the entire event. Because for the first time, historians could reconstruct the battle from both perspectives. And the picture that emerged was very different from the legends. Historians struggled with a fundamental problem. Most accounts of the battle came from one side, the British side. Commanders had written reports describe events that unfolded in confusion and chaos. No one possessed a complete picture. That began to change when researchers started examining Ottoman military archives alongside British records. For the first time, historians could compare both sides of the battle. The results were revealing, and in many ways, they offered the clearest explanation yet for the fate of the missing battalion. The documents suggested that the Norfolk Regiment had advanced much farther than many commanders initially realized. As the attack developed, parts of the battalion continued moving forward while neighboring units struggled to keep pace. The battlefield itself contributed to the confusion. Ridges blocked visibility. Vegetation concealed movement. Communication between units broke down. And officers had only limited information about what was happening beyond their immediate position. What appeared from a distance to be a coordinated advance was gradually becoming something else, an isolated push into enemy-held territory. According to Ottoman records, British troops entered an area defended by determined Ottoman forces. What followed was not a mysterious disappearance. It was a battle, a brutal one. The defenders launched counterattacks. Heavy fire struck the advancing soldiers. Units became separated. Formations broke apart. And the men who had advanced beyond support suddenly found themselves facing overwhelming resistance. The farther they pushed forward, the more vulnerable they became. Without communication, without reinforcement, without neighboring units to support their flanks, the battlefield that had hidden them from British observers was now working against them. And once the battalion became isolated, events moved quickly. Ottoman accounts describe intense fighting. British records describe the loss of contact. Together, they paint a picture of a force trapped as survived with a complete understanding of what happened. The story gradually transformed into something larger than the battle itself, a mystery, a legend, a disappearance. The modern explanation is not based on a single document, nor on a single witness. It emerged from years of historical research, from comparing reports written by men who fought on opposite sides of the same battlefield. And while historians continue to debate certain details, the overall picture is remarkably consistent. The battalion did not vanish into another world. It did not disappear into a supernatural cloud. It became isolated during a confused attack and was ultimately destroyed in combat. For many researchers, this explanation resolves the central mystery. But not everyone is satisfied. Because even after all the reports were examined, even after the bodies were found, even after the archives were opened, some questions still remained. Questions that continue to keep this story alive more than a century later. And those unanswered questions may explain why Gallipoli still fascinates historians today. More than a century has passed since those events unfolded at Gallipoli. The battlefield has long since fallen silent. The trenches have disappeared beneath grass and earth, and the empires that fought there no longer exist. Yet the story of the missing soldiers continues to attract attention, not because historians failed to find answers, but because they never found every answer. The modern evidence provides a far clearer picture than the families of 1915 ever possessed. Researchers now understand the broader context of the battle. They understand how the attack unfolded. They understand why the battalion became isolated. And they understand how a military disaster gradually transformed into a legend. But history is rarely as neat as people would like it to be. Not every soldier was identified. Not every body was recovered. And not every detail of the battle can be reconstructed with certainty. Some records were incomplete. Some witnesses saw only fragments of the fighting. Others remembered events decades after they occurred. Even today, historians continue debating specific details of the attack, not because the evidence points towards something supernatural, but because combat rarely leaves behind a perfect record. Especially in a place like Gallipoli, the campaign itself was filled with confusion, miscommunication, contradictory reports, and decisions made under enormous pressure. The disappearance of the Norfolk soldiers became one of the most famous examples of that chaos, a reminder that entire units could vanish from the awareness of their own commanders, not because they ceased to exist, but because war often destroys information as effectively as it destroys lives. Perhaps that is why the story continues to resonate, because beneath the legend lies something deeply human. Families searching for answers. Commanders trying to understand events they never witnessed. Investigators piecing together clues decades later, and historians attempting to separate memory from fact. The famous cloud may never have existed, but the uncertainty certainly did. The unanswered questions certainly did, and for the families who spent years waiting for news, that uncertainty was real enough. In the end, Gallipoli reminds us that some of history's greatest mysteries are not born from the impossible. They are born from the absence of certainty. From the missing report, the lost witness, the unanswered question. And sometimes, those questions survive far longer than the people who first asked them. That may be the true legacy of the missing battalion, not that the soldiers disappeared, but that their story became something larger than the battle itself. A mystery that outlived a war, a mystery that outlived a mire, and a mystery that outlived an empire, and a mystery that continues to be discussed more than 100 years later. Was a tragedy born from the chaos of war, a place where confusion created a legend that survived for generations. But the next mystery would emerge under very different circumstances. Not on a battlefield, not in the middle of an invasion, but inside a military project that, according to some people, should never have become public. A project surrounded by secrecy, a warship, a classified experiment, and claims so extraordinary that they continue to divide opinion even today. Because while the mystery of Gallipoli was created by the fog of war, the next story begins with something far stranger. The rumor that a ship vanished before the eyes of its own crew. And that is where our next investigation begins.